I'm here at the University of Minnesota exploring the soul of Western civilization. The DNA of the Western civilization was written in the universities and monasteries in Europe. Now, the universities have rejected the ideas that created the modern West. Therefore, in a series of lectures, I'm exploring if the sun must now set on the West. None of us were happy with the title for tonight's talk, From Scottish Reformation to the Iraqi Quagmire. The problem was that everybody felt that no one knows what Scottish Reformation is all about and why we should be bothered about it. So I thought of changing the title from Freedom to Fascism. That sounded simple and good, but then the problem came up. Who knows about fascism? And who claims that title for himself, that I'm a fascist? So we hadn't improved at all. Finally, we decided to keep the title because I will be proposing that America has gotten itself into a quagmire in Iraq because the lessons of Scottish Reformation have been forgotten. And because freedom is not understood, fascism is also not understood, and we don't know how close actually America is to fascism. I will be showing that in 1930, Adolf Hitler said that nothing makes me more certain of our victory in Germany than the fact of the success of our ideas in the universities. The fascist ideas were gaining ground in German universities. Therefore, within 10 years of that statement, graduates, university graduates, scientists, doctors, engineers, administrators, civil servants, they were managing Hitler's mass murder machine. And the ideas that were being taught in Germany in the 1930s are now being taught in American universities. So we will be considering that in a few minutes. A very simple anecdote will help us understand how America's freedom, or Western freedoms, came out of Scottish Reformation. You might recall the presidential election of 2000 when Governor George W. Bush ran against Vice President Al Gore. And there was a great drama for 5-6 weeks. Nobody was certain who will ultimately be declared the next president of America. Finally, on December 13th, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of now President Bush. During that whole election campaign, in my judgment, the most profound political speech came out of Vice President Gore's mouth, which was his concession speech. In his brief concession speech, he said that at the entrance of the library of one of our leading law schools, which is Harvard Law School, these words are inscribed, not under men, but under God and law. So he said, the Supreme Court has spoken. I strongly disagree with what the court has decided, but I accept that verdict as final, and therefore I congratulate George Bush as the next president of America. Now that quotation, which is inscribed on Harvard Law School, not under men, but under God and law, comes from Henry Brecton, who systematized the British common law and argued that justice, not brute force, should rule in society on the basis of what God has done in the cross of Jesus Christ. He argued that God could have destroyed Satan, he could have destroyed sinners using his almighty power, but God doesn't use force. He uses justice and compassion, both of which meet perfectly in the cross of Christ. If God himself governs in human affair with justice, so must we. Not force, not power, but justice ought to rule. Might should be subjected to the right. Now, that statement from Vice President Al Gore is very interesting. Not under men, but under God. He had won the popular mandate, the majority vote, as you would recall. So in terms of number of votes, he had polled more votes than President Bush. But the law says that the president will not be whoever gets the majority vote, but whoever has the majority in the electoral college. He had lost the electoral college, and therefore he lost the election. Most Americans had forgotten that in American system of election, it is not majority that elects the president, but majority in the electoral college that elects the president. Why is that so? That is because American democracy didn't come from Greek democracies, which did mean a majority rule, majority vote. American democracy came out of the Scottish Reformation, which was a return to the Bible. It began in the Church of Scotland and turned a hierarchical Episcopal church into a Presbyterian system of government, where the rule was by elders and session and synod and finally the General Assembly. So people will elect the elders and elders will govern. It's the elders who will rule. And there were strong biblical reasons and tradition why that system emerged in Scotland. And the whole Presbyterian movement or denominations were shaped by those theological and biblical discussions in Scotland. They began to have profound impact on America when America was still 13 different colonies, not one nation. There were Presbyterian churches. They were governed by elders and sessions. Above them were presbyteries, and above them were synod, and then a general assembly where people from all the 13 colonies came together, and the decisions that were made were taken to all the 13 colonies and were binding, even though they were politically separate colonies. America was not one nation, but they obeyed the decisions made by the General Assembly. So that was the pattern that the Constitution of America adopted essentially from the Presbyterian system of government. And 14 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Presbyterians, and the only clergyman who signed the Declaration of Independence, John Witherspoon, was a Presbyterian minister. So, if it had been India or if it had been another country, Vice President Al Gore's followers would have gone on riots. You know, we won the popular vote. The presidency belongs to us. And if nothing else, we need to have a re-election. But it's God and His law, and law approved by the nation and by the Supreme Court, that will rule. This will be a nation under God, Because this lesson has been forgotten, democracy is now interpreted as majority rule. You have election, whoever has the majority, he rules. And that idea is what was being sold to Iraq, that you need freedom, freedom equals democracy, democracy equals election and majority rule. So let's have a constitution and let's have an election. And obviously the election throws up Shiites as the majority because they are numerical majority. Now the Sunnis have a problem, that can we trust the Shiites to use their political power for justice, that this power will not be abused to discriminate against us, to harass us? Because when our people were in power, Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni, when our Ba'athist party was in power, we abused our power to oppress the minorities, Kurds and the Shiites and the Christians and others, because might rules, not the right. But democracy is terrible because democracy is going to always throw up a Shiite government. And then we know that the power will be abused against us. England's greatest historian of freedom, Lord Acton, who was a Roman Catholic, he's the one who gave us the dictum that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. He also made this statement that the tyranny of the minority or a despot like Saddam Hussein is terrible. But the only thing worse than the tyranny of the minority is tyranny of the majority. Because if you have one despot, there is power in the oppressed majority, which can finally throw off in a revolution, in a civil war, in an assassination attempt, throw off or destroy the tyranny of a minority. But what can the minority do when the majority becomes tyrannical? If it is rule of men, rule of the majority, then if majority is oppressive and tyrannical and unjust, then the minority can only suffer. He said treason is the only option available to the minority at that point. Now, Lord Acton said that because this, in fact, was the lesson throughout history. Both Mussolini and Hitler, fascist Nazi political dictators who are the archetype of evil, despotic rules, both of them came to power through democratic elections. In the last few years, we have seen the democratic elections throwing up a militant government in Iran, democratic elections throwing up Hamas in Palestine, and America will have nothing to do with a democratically elected government in Palestine because it's militant. If democratic elections are held today in Pakistan, it's very likely that a militant government will come to power if really free and fair elections are held. If right and wrong, just and unjust, are decided by the majority, then whatever the majority decides is the law, is justice, unless there is a transcendent source of justice which transcends the rulers, which transcends the majority, which is God, which is what Al Gore is saying, that this nation will not be under men, but under God and law ultimately having its roots in God. This principle is important because fascism is exactly the opposite. Fascism has been defined as active, aggressive resistance to transcendence. Any idea that there is a moral authority above human beings, above rulers, above the majority, active opposition to transcendence, that we do not want to be a nation under God. We want to be a nation under men. That is the heart of fascism, where men will have ultimate authority. And I will be arguing that people who reject the ultimate authority or sovereignty of God condemn themselves to be ruled exclusively by sinful men. All rulers are sinful, but when you have rejected the authority or sovereignty of God, you've condemned yourself to be ruled exclusively by authority of sinful men. And that is the heart of fascism. The question is, why did America choose to forget the lessons of Scottish Reformation, which either Al Gore or his speechwriter tried to convey to America and the world? And in his speech, he went on to say that this is the source of American liberties. Not under men, but under God and law. This is the source of American liberties, therefore I accept it. But many Americans don't really remember that or take that seriously. Why? Because after the First World War, a great number of Americans started going to the universities, and many of the returning veterans who were coming back from war, they had gone into the army as young people. Now they needed to find another job after the war, so they needed to go to the university to learn new things and new skills and new subjects to find civilian employment. So suddenly universities began to swell, and also there were many refugees coming, especially from Europe in the 1920s, and therefore they needed a course on history, course on Western civilization. So Columbia College in New York and Chicago University wrote curriculum on Western civilization to educate these people on what is the West all about. The Chicago curriculum was great books curriculum, and Columbia curriculum was more like great ideas curriculum. And that's where this myth was invented, that Western democracy came from Greek democracies. So they were looking at magical movements in Western history, beginning with Greek and Romans and the Middle Ages, and bypassing the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and French Revolution, etc., and talking about great books, great ideas, that this is how the West became free. These university curriculums in Western civilization were popularized by Will Durant's story of civilization. He was giving lectures in a Presbyterian church in New York, and then started publishing those lectures, first as the story of philosophy, then as a story of civilization. Those two university courses and Will Durant's story of civilization created this 20th century myth that democracy, capitalism, science, technology, or what we call the Western civilization, came from Greece through Rome and through Germanic tribes and some contribution of Christianity, etc. So American intellectual during the 20th century chose to deceive itself about its history. Now, by the 1950s and early 60s, this grand story of Western civilization that was being taught in these liberal universities people were beginning to feel that there is something terribly wrong here, because civil rights movement was emerging, women's lib movement was emerging, Vietnam War was going on, that in fact we are a civilization which is not all this great and grand. We have racism, we have sexism, we have discrimination against women, and we are monocultural, and this monocultural is really white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant male civilization, which finally led to 1965, the Stanford University students with Jesse Jackson chanting the slogan, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ got to go." What we've been told in this liberal meta-narrative or the grand narrative of Western civilization is simply not true. That led to the whole deconstructionist movement, that let's begin to deconstruct what we have been teaching ourselves about our history and about our past. And so you have the feminist history, and you have the black history, and you have multicultural history. The result of the intellectual ferment of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s is that now nobody wants to take any position on what exactly is the soul of Western civilization, the source of West's freedom, economic prosperity, justice, rule of law, science and technology, and human rights, etc. There is a loss of confidence in any position, because if you take a position, you will be the target of the next deconstructionist school of thought and thinkers. There is obviously in all of these stories a germ of truth. The idea that Western liberty or democracy came from Greece rested really on one episode about 500 years before Christ, when the Persians were attacking the Greeks. And the Persian tyrants had a huge army, but Greek city-states were able to defeat these armies, and a Greek historian, Herodotus, explained why Greece won. Small Greek armies defeated these big Persian army, and he said that these soldiers were really slaves of a tyrant. Greeks were free citizens of democracy. They had their property, their freedom, a lot at stake which they needed to protect. Democracy gives strength to small individuals, and that's what had made Greek strong. And that was a true incident, and that was picked up out of all context and blown up by this liberal narrative that American democracy and Western democracy originated in Greek democracies. The fact was that Greeks had turned against democracy. The most important Greek political classic was Plato's Republic, where he is discussing how to create an utopian, a perfect society in his Republic. And he condemns democracy as the worst of all political systems. And the reason he condemns democracy as the worst of all political systems is because democracy had killed his mentor, Socrates. So it was terrible, because democracy is mobocracy, rule of the mob. To fight democracy, Plato proposed that philosopher kings should be nurtured, and they ought to rule the world, and they ought to rule the city-states. Democracy has never succeeded in Greece for more than 30 years or so. They tried it several times, but each time it collapsed. Plato's successor, Aristotle, trained Alexander the Great to become a philosopher king. But Alexander the Great ended up as one of the most ruthless tyrants in history, who went all over the world conquering the world. So Greeks never took their own experiments of democracy seriously and didn't think of democracy as the source of freedom, a source of strength, etc. They repudiated democracy. Alexander's triumphs across the world Hellenized the world. The impact of Alexander was enormous. In South India, 1,500 miles beyond where Alexander went. In South India, the Buddha is Greek Buddha. That was part of Hellenization. The Greek culture did influence the world. Christ's disciples, apostles, they are writing the scriptures, the gospels, but they're not writing them in the sacred language of the Jews, which is Hebrew. They're writing it in Greek. That's Hellenization. So Hellenization was a very strong movement, but nowhere in the world where Greek influence Hellenized the world did it create a quest for freedom or a quest for democracy. In fact, Alexander became such an icon that he triggered off movements of petty tyrants who would like to build their own empires. So these were philosopher kings who were trying to rule over others. Hellenization, a Greek culture, never triggered off a quest for freedom. Freedom was a uniquely biblical value. The Bible, including the book of Genesis, is written in that experience of Exodus as the Hebrew slaves in Egypt cry out to God against slavery and ask for freedom, and God sends Moses to go and speak to Pharaoh to let my people go. They cry out to God for freedom because slavery is an awful situation. And then Moses goes as the deliverer, and he delivers them, and then he teaches them how to sustain their freedom. That's what Ten Commandments is all about. That you go into the promised land, and it's not going to be much fun if you end up with a Jewish Pharaoh. You've had an Egyptian Pharaoh, but an Egyptian Pharaoh is oppressing Egyptians also. If you have Jewish despots, dictators, tyrants, that isn't going to serve any purpose. But how do you retain or maintain your freedom? That's the whole point of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments begin that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery. I am the liberator who set you free. Therefore, you shall not have any other gods beside me. Because if you give the right to your priest to create your gods, then whoever invents your gods will also invent your morality. And if he is a sinner, he is going to invent a morality that suits him. That I am the highest caste, you are low caste, you should touch my feet, you should serve my interests. You want a law that is binding on the rulers. The rulers will not covet your property, will not covet your wives, and will not take your sons as their slaves and covet your vineyards or your property. A law that comes from above human beings. So, as Moses is leading them at the end of his life, he says that you might want kings, but kings will become tyrannical unless they meditate on this law of God and not turn from it to the left or to the right. After him, Joshua becomes the leader, and he is taught the same thing, that you must meditate on the law of God day and night, not turn from it to the left or the right. So as leaders, you are under law, then your people are free. Freedom means rule of law. And law can be binding over rulers only if the ultimate source of law is from outside human beings. If law is man-made, then those who have the power to make the law or change the law will always be above the law. You will always have rule of the ruler and never rule of law. We learned that lesson in India during the emergency in 1975 when Mrs. Gandhi was convicted of corruption by Allahabad High Court, and she declared a national emergency, put all the opposition in jails. All the intellectuals, all the oppositions were in jail because now the Constitution is suspended, so fundamental rights are suspended. And she was challenged by one of our most respected lawyer that there is a basic feature to the Constitution that the rulers of the day cannot change. There are fundamental rights. Well, her response was that we wrote the Constitution, we can change it. Why do we have to be bound by the wisdom of another generation? Because we can change the Constitution, we can change the law. So if the ultimate source of law is men, then the people who have the power to make the law, change the law, will always be above the law, and you will always have rule of the ruler. And that's what makes the rule of the majority so terrifying to Sunnis in Iraq. Let's put it differently. You know, since you were children, you've been taught that Abraham Lincoln said that democracy is government of the people, for the people, by the people. That's what democracy is. Majority rule. Suppose you have a meeting with President Lincoln, and you say to him, Mr. President, you said democracy means majority rule. And suppose the majority in the 19th century is white, and the majority says that slavery is okay. Is it okay? Lincoln would say, man, are you blind? Can't you say that I have taken up the guns to fight against slavery because the majority has no right to be wrong? Majority is under God's law. Majority has no right to be wrong. Right and wrong isn't decided by the majority. It comes from God. So you're told that democracy was defined by Abraham Lincoln as the government of the people, for the people, by the people. You're never told that actually Lincoln was quoting the preface of Wycliffe Bible. That statement came from the preface to Wycliffe Bible. Wycliffe was 150 years before Scottish Reformation, and he was the first one who attempted to translate the Bible into English so that common people can have the Word of God. If the Bible is actually the Word of God, then common people have a means with which they can judge their judges, judge their kings, judge their bishops and popes, and God's Word shall rule over all human beings. Then right and wrong will be decided with reference to God's Word, not man's wisdom. I began to wrestle with these things when I first saw this statue, which you see. It's from South Africa. It's a powerful monument, a 16th century peasant woman. She is standing atop a globe. Behind her is a triune arch symbolizing her triune God, and over that is the cross and a scepter. The interesting thing is that in one hand she has the Bible, and in her other hand is broken chain. Now, 16th century, the flowering of the Renaissance. Europe is reading Greek and Roman literature and classics. The question that thrust itself upon me was that if the Western democracy came from Greece, why isn't this peasant woman holding Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Ethics or one of the Greek classics? Why is she holding the Bible? What does the Bible have to do with her broken chains? So this is called Huguenot Monument in Franschhoek village in South Africa. And I began to read up the story of the Huguenots, because they were the ones who really originated the idea of constitutional democracy. It began in 1540s in France, first impact of Martin Luther, then impact of John Calvin. To cut a long story short, there were periods of persecution. The first church, about 60 of them were arrested and all were burnt at stake. So this was highly totalitarian, oppressive regime which didn't allow any freedom of religion and freedom of conscience and freedom of worship. The great massacre of the Huguenots happened in 1572 on St. Bartholomew's Day, when the gates of Paris were locked. 2 o'clock in the morning, church bells started ringing, and the Queen and the Pope had brought mercenaries from Switzerland, and they started killing the Huguenots at 2 o'clock in the morning. Historians disagree how many people were killed, anywhere from 5,000 to 30,000 in Paris alone. Now, out of that tremendous atrocity of religious bigotry came 3 books by Hartmann and Theodore Beza, who took over the leadership of the Reformation from Calvin. After Calvin, he was the leader of the Calvinist movement. And third by Mornay, which was published anonymously. And Mornay's book, Defense of Liberty Against Tyranny, this was the book that really impacted the American Revolution. Defense of Liberty Against Tyranny. King George is a tyrant, and we must rise up in a revolution for liberty. He gave a theology of liberation. The idea that a nation such as America should not be ruled by a king, but by a president, came from his book. A president is someone who presides amongst equal, first amongst equal. Someone who is not a king, therefore he can be impeached by other magistrates. Theodore Beza's book was called The Rights of Magistrates. When the king says, kill so-and-so, simply because he is following a heretical teaching, do the magistrates have the right to disobey the king and defend that individual? Human rights have no meaning without the right of the magistrate to oppose the executive, to oppose the military, to oppose the police. So Beza's book, Rights of Magistrates, really became the source of the rights of men, which 200 years later, the Bill of Rights was introduced here and also in France on the basis of Beza's book, The Rights of Magistrates. These 3 books by Hartmann, Beza, and Mornay are known as the Trilogy of Freedom. Now, they were crushed in France. They didn't succeed in France. But that massacre and their teaching influenced what happened in Scotland. This is from a wall in Geneva, 4 reformers, Calvin, Farel, Beza, and Knox. So Knox was fleeing from Scotland. He was in Geneva with Calvin, became a friend of Beza, and then went to Scotland and began the Scottish Reformation. Geneva was a republic, and they brought that republican idea to the church government first, succeeded in democratizing the church. Church became the nursery of democracy. Later, those ideas began to be applied to political system. It culminated in 1597 in a very famous conflict between Andrew Melville, who had taken over the leadership of the Scottish Reformation from John Knox. Knox was dead. Melville was one of the greatest scholars at that time. He was reforming the education system in Scotland, but also defending the Presbyterian system of government. At that time, King James VI, who became King James I of England, King James VI of Scotland, was ruling Scotland, and he was in his own right a scholar and wrote 2 books in 1 year defending the medieval doctrine of the divine rights of kings, that God had given divine rights to kings, therefore the people have to obey him, lower magistrates have to obey him, they cannot be superseded by lower magistrates, which was really the theology of tyranny. In a heated argument, Melville physically caught hold of King James and shook him up, and calling him God's foolish servant. That there are two kingdoms in Scotland. You are the king of the Commonwealth, then there is the kingdom of Christ, and we pray every day, thy kingdom come, thy will be done in Scotland as it is in heaven. His kingdom is the church. And you, James, are not the head of Christ's kingdom. You're not a leader, you're an ordinary member. Now imagine a mullah talking like that to Saddam Hussein before the invasion, that you are God's foolish servant, and Iraq is supposed to be God's kingdom. Well, the problem is Islam denies that God comes to this earth to establish his kingdom. If God does not come to this earth to establish his kingdom, then we have no option but to be ruled exclusively by sinful men. But the Jews look forward to God's anointed Messiah to come to this earth to demolish the beastly kingdoms of Persia and Babylon and Greek and Rome, to establish God's kingdom, a kingdom that will never end. Because God has come, that's what they were looking forward to, a Messiah. One who will break the yokes of oppression, break every chain, set the captives free. One who would invite all those who are weary and heavy laden, sheep that are harassed and helpless, ruled by wolves, who will invite them to come unto me, take my yoke upon you, because then you will find rest, then you will find peace. If God does not come here to establish his kingdom of justice and peace, then we have no option but to be ruled exclusively by sinful men. But since God has come, Scotland ought to be the kingdom of Christ. That's why America should have no king. That's why the president can be impeached by his subordinates, because he has all the power to do right, but no power has been given to him to do wrong. This will not be a nation ruled by men, but under God and his law. That is the source of freedom. As the West forgets its heritage, forgets its own source of freedom, it has nothing to offer to the world. I would strongly recommend Jean Edward Wheat's book on fascism, modern and postmodern. This is a fascinating study which shows that all the ideas that created the intellectual climate in Germany, that destroyed freedom and gave rise to fascism, all those ideas are now being taught in American universities. First of all is the value of individual. The individual is, and I mentioned this actually in the lecture on human dignity, that if God came and gave his life to save individuals who possess immortal souls, then the state has to respect the individuals. Individuals don't exist for the state exists for individuals. And you can take the president, the governor or the Congress to court if they violate your rights. Now, that sanctity of the individual is demolished by postmodern deconstructionism. That because you don't have a soul, you are simply chemistry which is culturally conditioned. You are a product of your culture. Language creates your sense of individuality. This is a very important theme in postmodern thought, that the sense of individuality, sense of self is function of the language, which in turn is function of culture. So individual isn't important. Now that has implications. The idea of right and wrong, that the majority doesn't have the right to be wrong, because right and wrong is binding on whoever is the ruler, even if it's the majority. It comes from outside. Now that idea of objective right and wrong, that has been destroyed. Now the universities cannot talk about what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad in any meaningful sense, except for what we approve of, what is politically correct and what is politically incorrect. So far it was universities which couldn't talk about right and wrong. Now even middle schools can't talk about, at least in Maine, even middle schools can't talk about what is right and what is wrong, what kids should do and what kids shouldn't do. Parents can't talk about it. If right and wrong are gone, then what you have is Nietzsche's will to power, which is what political correctness is all about. You're only allowed to say what we allow you to say. Yeah. So your individual conscience, your beliefs about right and wrong don't matter. You will not be given tenure in the university unless you fall in line. The culture is about power. It's not about objective values anymore. The individual consciousness, as I said, is merged into mass. Now this means that discussion, serious political, moral, social conversation ends, and it becomes all about rhetoric and propaganda. Now it doesn't matter whether you're on the left or on the right. The whole government machinery indulged in a propaganda about weapons of mass destruction. Then it indulged in a whole propaganda about the need to liberate Iraq, the triumph of freedom. These are not serious discussions. What is freedom? How did we become free? What exactly are we trying to do in Iraq? What you have is propaganda and power, not serious discussion, because reason is no longer trusted. One of the impact of Freud's psychoanalysis was really to destroy reason. We focused, when we discussed Freud, we focused on the question of love, that love is destroyed, love is reduced to chemistry. But in fact, rationality is destroyed, reason is destroyed, because when you go into the subconscious mind, according to Freud and Jung and all the others who followed, human beings are driven by passions and instincts and lusts, and the rational consciousness is only a very thin veneer to cover up, to rationalize our desires and instincts and lusts and fears and angers and hatreds and likes and dislikes. So rationality is only rationalization. Therefore, a serious rational discussion isn't expected to lead us to truth, to what is right, what is good, what is beautiful, because these objective values no longer exist. So this now, combined with aesthetics of violence, it's not just Hollywood, but video games, as well as serious artists who are glorifying through their art the aesthetics of violence, are some of the cultural ingredients which are preparing. The conscience is seared, the minds are darkened, and the stage is set for America's mass murder machine to be operated by university graduates. Most of the great reform movements in Western history actually began in the universities and were led by university professors. So Wycliffe was in Oxford, Luther was in Wittenberg, John Hus was in Prague. So the reform movements were led by university professors who realized that society is built on ideas. False ideas enslave and destroy. True ideas, truth liberates. So they searched for truth, stood for truth, paid for truth with their lives, risked their lives to propagate truth, and began to reform. Now, obviously, having the truth is not enough. You may have to pay a price, and that's what calls for heroism. So Tuesday after next, we will be discussing that the idea of heroism, which really created the modern West, of not a hero like Alexander the Great, who is going out to conquer the world, to subjugate the world, but those who are heroic enough to stand for truth and give their lives for truth that would transform societies. What our experience in India is showing is that once a constitution is created, an election system is created, and you make mistakes and walk like a little baby, falling and rising and walking again, eventually the political system could force you to seek the intellectual, spiritual, moral, cultural resources to sustain that system. And that sort of thing could happen in Iraq, because there's no way you can go back to Saddam Hussein. He's dead, his sons are dead, his party is disintegrated. So you can't go back. So where do you go? Well, at this moment, you have no option but to make the present constitution work, which is given by President Bush. However much you hate him, this is the constitution that you have. This is what you have to work with. The alternative is chaos of a civil war. So once you begin to work with this system, which didn't really originate out of your own culture and consciousness, if you begin to like it, then it could force you, okay, we need justice, we need tolerance. This is not part of our traditional culture, but we have to change. It will take a lot of patience, it will take a lot of work, but it could begin to transform the Muslim community. And what has happened in Iraq has changed Iraqi culture, and Iraqi culture could begin to produce moderate Muslims who acquired power, like Benazir Bhutto has just gone back to Pakistan from England. As a student, she was the president of Student Union in Oxford. So she's very, very much a British woman, and is taking back British values. Now, if she did become the prime minister under Musharraf as the president, you have 5 years to fight militant Islam. It's possible to transform Pakistan from within. It's hard to predict future, but in the West, ideas and beliefs came first, social, political reality came second. In India, political structure came first. Now we are being forced to change ourselves and learn to manage that system and use that system properly. So it could work, but ultimately, if culture and beliefs and morals don't change, you will not be able to sustain it. The statement that I quoted from Vice President Al Gore suggests that some people, at least the script writers, know the recipe for West's freedom. But what the administration and the government has been doing in Iraq shows that probably they don't. The fact that nobody knows about Scottish Reformation, nobody knows why America doesn't have a king, it has a president, suggests that America has chosen to forget its own secret of why it is free. We take freedom for granted. It is a very, very fragile fruit. Freedom is not part of every culture. Now, it's true that everybody wants to have happy marriage, but not everybody is capable of having happy monogamous marriage, as we know. So everybody may want freedom, but not everybody is capable of having, sustaining, enjoying, and using freedom responsibly. What enabled the West to create freedom? My closing word really would be that it is not the genes. America doesn't have freedom because Americans were white. So were the Germans, and so were the Russians. It has nothing to do with the color of your skin or your genes. It is a fruit of a complex belief system, ideas which came from the Bible. And as the West rejects or amputates its own soul, the terrible scenario is America becoming fascist. The world's sole superpower becoming a fascist state would be awful for the whole world, would be awful for America, and would be awful for minorities in America. And therefore, I think this whole discussion of what is freedom, how do you sustain freedom, and how do you empower other people to be free is a very important discussion. And I know that we've only begun to discuss this subject. We will pursue, because what is liberty without virtue? The idea of objective values, what is beautiful, what is good, what is right. Those things have to be recovered for freedom to survive. The whole point of freedom is to subject might to right. But is there something which is right in itself? That's our topic for next Tuesday. Thank you very much. These lively interactions with students, faculty, and community at the University of Minnesota have reinforced my faith that there is no reason for the West to amputate its own soul. A recovery of faith is possible and desirable. The sun need not set on the West.